Today, China's silent invasion. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to the latest posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined by Clive Hamilton, Professor of Public Ethics at Charles Sturt University in Canberra. Hello, Clive.
G'day, Martin.
Really appreciate your time. And boy, you've just recently published in February a remarkable book called Silent Invasion, China's Influence in Australia. I've read the book and it is a bombshell.
Yeah, well, it seems to have shaken the foundations in certain parts of Australian society, and it also attracted a great deal of interest overseas, particularly in the United States, Canada, Taiwan, and Japan, oddly enough. I guess it's because in those nations they are very familiar with the kind of influence operations that I describe in great detail in the book. And I think many people in Australia who read it, and there have been a lot of them, it was a bestseller pretty much straight away, have been really shocked at the extent to which the Chinese Communist Party is involved in influence and interference operations in Australia. So in that regard, although a couple of people have written papers about CCP influence and influence techniques, no one had written a kind of comprehensive book describing for a nation how the Chinese Communist Party goes about influencing and interfering in the politics and the debate in another society.
And what was interesting to me, Clive, was that a lot of that influence is, a little bit quiet, a little bit soft, but very powerful, isn't it, in terms of almost below the waterline?
Well, that's how it operates for the most part. It's covert, it's secretive, it's subtle. At times it's coercive, although typically with a kind of deniability. And the essential approach of the Chinese Communist Party in promoting its objective of dominating other countries and eventually becoming the global hegemonic power, replacing the United States, is to work on the elites. They're not so worried about the mass of ordinary people. They want to go where the power lies. And so their influence operations are focused primarily on political, business, university, media, and cultural elites. And they have a whole range of techniques that they use to win those elites over. And so what we see is basically a process over some years, many years, of grooming powerful and influential people in a way that they're not aware of, to basically start to see the world the way the Chinese Communist Party wants them to see it. And occasionally we see very glaring instances of it. We've seen one, more than one, but one in particular I'm thinking of in recent times, and that is after the Australian government made a perfectly reasonable proposal for there to be an international independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, perhaps the loudest voice telling the Australian government not to do it and to backtrack, that is, apart from Chinese Communist Party agencies in Beijing, was Andrew Forrest, the mining billionaire, who essentially has become a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party in Australia. He is convinced that he is acting in Australia's interests. And that's the beauty and the insidiousness of the way the Chinese Communist Party goes about its influence operations. They target powerful and influential people and persuade them that what is in China's interests is in Australia's interests, and therefore anyone like our federal Minister for Foreign Affairs who does something that upsets Beijing is actually acting against Australia's interests. And so with someone as unreflective as Andrew Forrest, he becomes an extremely influential player in the Chinese Communist Party's influence operation in this country.
And it's interesting because it's not just money and trade, is it? It's a whole bunch of other influencing techniques that they use too.
You bet. And, some people have said in response to Andrew Forrest's intervention, oh, look, he just makes all his money in China, which is true, and therefore he's just looking after his financial interests. Now, I think the CCP, without doubt, leverages that financial interest that he has in China and continuing trade. But I actually think it's far more subtle than that. I think it's not simply, oh, Andrew Forrest thinks my money is threatened, I better tell the foreign minister to pipe down. I think that his mind has been rewired through his years of contact with CCP officials, many of whom don't appear to him to be CCP officials, but just good blokes, Chinese businessmen. And so he has been groomed in this way, where he genuinely believes that this is in Australia's interest, to tell the Australian government in Canberra to back off and don't call for an international inquiry. And so even if he sold up all of his interests and had no other dollar invested in China, his brain would still be rewired in that way.
And one question I did have was, the relationship between CCP and the rest of China is quite interesting, isn't it? Right? Because, people might actually be thinking they're interacting with just normal, Chinese business people, but often the tentacles of the CCP are actually plugged in there behind the scenes.
Always and everywhere. Whenever a foreigner, whether it be Andrew Forrest or a parliamentary delegation or the mayor of Wagga or a delegation of journalists taken to China by Bob Carr, they never meet ordinary people. Everyone they meet, who apparently is an ordinary person or just a technician or a financial officer or council worker in Shanghai or whatever, if they're not Chinese Communist Party members, then they certainly know what the drill is. And so they get this, the foreigners get this consistent picture of China, of the message. It's very consistent, carefully worked out messaging. And they come away just believing that that is what Chinese people think, that's how the world is, that's how they see Australia. And I tell the story in the book, in Silent Invasion, of one of those groups of journalists that Bob Carr took to China. So these are some of Australia's most senior, hard-bitten journalists. They would never fall for this propaganda. They see through things and they write the truth as it is. But they came back from this trip on China and they started writing columns which were exactly what the Chinese Communist Party would want them to write. I mean, they fell for it, hook, line and sinker. And look, I'm pretty hard on them in the book, but, only by quoting what they say. But what I think it speaks to is that the techniques which the CCP has developed through the nearly 100 years of its history are very clever, they're very subtle, they're refined over time, and they work. And so unless you go into it with an understanding of how these things work, how the Communist Party works, the kind of techniques that will be applied to you, there's a very high chance that you're going to get sucked in. Not everyone does, of course, but actually I think most do.
Right, and quite often because there is this still strong trade connection with China and people don't want to upset that, and all of those things are there in the background, I would suggest. And I also am very interested in this media connectivity that you're talking about, because it's not necessarily overtly obvious, but when you stop and think about it, then you think, well, actually, yeah, there is and a very important connection between what's happening and what's being reported and what's being told in the media in Australia.
The media, of course, is extremely important. In fact, in my follow-up book to Silent Invasion, which I wrote with a German sinologist, Mareike Olberg, it's called Hidden Hand, and it's coming out very soon. We put a strong emphasis on what the Chinese Communist Party calls discourse control or discourse management. And for the Chinese Communist Party, arising out of kind of deep history of the party, for them, ideas matter. Ideas rule the world. Stalin once famously said, or was alleged to have said, ideas are more powerful than guns. We would not allow our enemies to have guns. Why would we allow them to have ideas? And so that's why the party it cracks down so fiercely on dissidents, that is, people with alternative ideas or people who challenge the CCP ideology in China. But also, and more relevant for our purposes, the CCP believes it is engaged in a persistent and pervasive struggle over ideas with the West. It is a paranoid party, a paranoid regime that must be recognised, and so they see threats and attempts to undermine it everywhere, and no more prominently than in the world of ideas and beliefs. And so the media, along with universities, become extremely important for trying to influence perceptions and understandings of the Chinese Communist Party. And all of that has been doubled or trebled under Xi Jinping, who has devoted enormous extra resources to the CCP's whole range of propaganda agencies and outlets and campaigns around the world, some of which, of course, are aimed at the mainstream media in the West.
And you mentioned universities. Of course, quite a few universities now have branches in China, don't they? And presumably that creates an interesting set of conflicts.
It does. I think it's true to say that certainly all of the group of 8 universities in Australia and many others as well, and all the same applies to universities in the United States and Canada, but incidentally none more so proportionally than in Australia, they've become dependent on flows of cash from China. And that has made the senior executives of our universities very, very prone to influence operations because, the best kind of influence operation is one where you're trying to persuade someone to believe something which is in their financial interest to believe. And so, we've seen university executives and quite a few academics, including a large part of the China scholarly community in Australia, essentially won over to a CCP or Beijing view of the world. And so along with Andrew Forrest, some of the most noisy megaphones basically spouting CCP propaganda in Australia have been some vice-chancellors. There was quite a disturbing story that I heard almost from the horse's mouth. A couple of years ago, the foreign minister then, which I think was Julie Bishop, made on the death of Liu Xiaobo, the dissident writer who died in a hospital prison, basically of medical neglect. He won a Nobel Prize, Peace Prize. When he died, there was great shock and sadness around the world, and the foreign minister issued a very anodyne statement saying how regrettable it was that this great writer had died. And Bishop had on the phone immediately a couple of mining billionaires and 2 vice-chancellors of Australian universities telling her that she's upset Beijing, she shouldn't say that kind of thing, and she really should watch out in the future what she says. Now, look, you expect that from mining billionaires. Yeah, I mean, they're pretty crude people who know which side of the bread is buttered. But vice chancellors are supposed to stand up for ideas, including and especially dissident ideas. I mean, this is what academic freedom is about. I mean, this is the fundamental point of Western universities, isn't it? I mean, in theory it is. And yet here we had these people who should above all in Australia be defending free speech and academic freedom, and those who defend free speech and academic freedom, telling the Foreign Minister of Australia that she should say nothing about the death, the tragic death of a Nobel Prize winning writer. I was shocked by that. I mean, even I was shocked by that. But that's the state of some of our universities today.
And then finally, we should touch on the political dimension, because in the book you do actually make the point that politicians are not immune to this either.
No, indeed. And we can kind of adapt a phrase, you know, the quickest way to a politician's heart is through a political donation. And, you know, when you have someone like the Chinese billionaire Huang Mo, who's now been kicked out of Australia because, as Yeo believes, he's a security threat because of his links to the Chinese Communist Party, when he makes very large donations to either political parties, I mean, these people are, you know, bipartisan in their, you know, political views. They want to influence everyone who might get into a position of power. Huang Mo, as it happens, tended to donate more of his money to the Labor Party, particularly in New South Wales. $100,000 is a huge donation. The secretary of a Labor Party or Liberal Party was kind of killed for that amount of money, one single donation, as we've seen in the ICAC investigations in Sydney last year, results of which have yet to emerge. We're watching that with bated breath. And so that gives a wealthy person immediate access and a great deal of influence, as we saw in the kind of, I think it's true now to say, the tragic case of Sam Dastyari, who essentially sold his soul to the Chinese Communist Party without understanding what he was doing. He now understands, and he's probably the most regretful ex-politician in Australia, which is fantastic. But it was actually that, watching this extraordinary level of donations to our two main political parties, and some went to the Nationals as well, but the Labor and Liberal in particular, that actually really stopped me in my tracks when newspaper stories started to appear in 2016, coming from some very dodgy characters. And I thought, what is going on? And it was that intriguing thought that really, above all else, provoked me into writing Silent Invasion.
Well, it's certainly pretty amazing, because almost wherever you look, you can see this sort of silent influence. But one last question on that specifically. There's this Belt and Road Initiative, which of course is, you know, money and infrastructure being laid out across many countries, including in some areas of Australia, I think. How does the silent and subversive thing we've been talking about connect to the Belt and Road?
Very, very deeply. And in fact, Marika Oldberg and I go into this in considerable depth in the new book, Hidden Hand, coming out soon. You know, there's a kind of narrative about the Belt and Road, which is very much the one that the Chinese Communist Party wanted to put out, and that is that we've got this surplus cash, we've built all of our roads and bridges and train lines, and so you know what we're going to do? We're going to go and link up the world with interconnectivity to enhance trade and investment, and we've got all this money. We're going to go and, you know, provide low interest loans and build these things, you know, on the belt and the road, across to Europe, down through Pakistan, you know, across through the stands, down through Southeast Asia to Australasia, and really it's now everywhere. Africa in particular. And on the face of it, it was, oh, they've got all this money, they need to get rid of it, they've got expertise, let them build. And of course, then people started to point out that often there was a kind of political quid pro quo that went with this, that the CCP or the Chinese government through the Belt and Road became a major investment in certain countries or parts of countries, and that gave them a great deal of access and influence over certain politicians and, of course, certain elements of the business community. So here they were exerting political influence. But, you know, in the course of writing this new book, we came to the view that there's a really deep, badly overlooked element of the whole Belt and Road Initiative, which actually occurred to me when I was looking at the agreement that Beijing had struck with Italy, which was very, very important because Italy, in signing a Belt and Road Agreement, was the first Western nation to sign up to it. And Beijing saw Italy as its kind of gateway into Europe to gain political influence. And there are elements in these, all of these Belt and Road Agreements, including the one that the Victorian government signed against the wishes of the Commonwealth. That's another discussion to have, which talks about a whole range of things that people just pass over. Oh, that's just guff. It's not really very important. But it covers things like media cooperation, cultural exchanges, sister city relationships, and a couple of other things like that. And so now we see things like the Belt and Road Health Alliance, the Belt and Road Think Tank Alliance, the Belt and Road University Alliance. And what we're seeing actually is a crucial element of Belt and Road is establishing a whole bunch of new linkages with countries and with the intellectual and cultural elites of countries as a way of exerting influence through ideas, through attitudes to beliefs. And so they look like all very nice, friendly cultural exchange, people to people, building links and alliances, all in the interests of global harmony, which is the kind of language that Xi Jinping uses. But in fact, it's subtly but very deliberately aimed at gaining influence over the purveyors of ideas, the purveyors of attitudes. And I think that in the long term, that is the most important aspect of the whole Belt and Road Agreement.
And I guess there's another angle here, and that is the human rights issues in China. Looking at it, it looks as though they sort of massage what's going on and present it differently to try and downplay things that we would otherwise perhaps think were pretty bad.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the CCP bosses in Beijing have suffered some pretty severe PR setbacks globally with the Hong Kong situation, but particularly with the Xinjiang concentration camps, which have really damaged its reputation. And so it's had to work very, very hard through all of the levers that it has at its disposal and which it has built and created throughout Western countries to try to shape the way people understand those issues in a way that makes them look less like really gross violations of human rights on a massive scale. And so shaping those narratives are extremely important to it. And one of the things that a number of commentators have pointed out is that if you remember that the Uyghur people are, for the most part, Islamic people, and that the CCP has a sustained and extremely well documented campaign of essentially religious cultural genocide, forcing men to cut off their beards, forcing them to drink alcohol, forcing women to take off their veils, preventing them from worshipping, or where they do, putting up pictures of Xi Jinping in the mosques. I mean, extraordinary stuff. forcing them to chant CCP slogans. I mean, this is kind of almost unbelievable. And yet there's been virtually no peep of criticism at all out of Muslim countries around the world. And so what that shows you is that the CCP has managed very effectively through a global campaign to gain influence in key Islamic countries like Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, like Indonesia, where you would expect huge outcry and mass demonstrations from ordinary Muslims against this awful violation of the rights of a really major Muslim population in the west of China.
And so what should we do then? I mean, obviously exposing this perhaps opens people's eyes, but is there more than we should be doing than that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, Martin. I mean, opening people's eyes is the most important thing. Because once people become aware of what's going on, that's the first line of resistance to the influence campaigns. And so we've seen that, we think, building on the Dastiari affair and the kind of uproar that created and the measures that the Turnbull government took to implement foreign interference laws, that has above all made almost all federal politicians, I think it's probably true to say, extremely wary about being coerced or otherwise persuaded to join in some kind of activity that is or could be a united front CCP operation in Australia. What I found frustrating, I have to say, is that this level of awareness and resistance, because no one ever, just remember what happened during the whole Dastiari affair and follow-up. You had, in federal parliament, you had people holding up photos in question time of Malcolm Turnbull, being great mates with Wang Jungmo, and then you had the government side holding up photos of Bill Shorten being great mates at Wang Jungmo or being present at his daughter's wedding. No one ever wants that to happen to them again. So people are very careful. But that's not true in the States. The States somehow have not got the message, or I think probably, oddly enough, in New South Wales there's more awareness of it. But certainly in Victoria, the Andrews government seems oblivious to the influence over it of United Front figures. Certainly in Perth, there's an enormous amount of CCP influence over the government there. So I think it's a long, slow process. And the various measures, the concrete measures, apart from awareness, are the foreign interference legislation that I mentioned, which is only now, in the last months, being enforced. When we're talking about the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme, where people operating on behalf of the foreign government need to register, we're talking about the foreign interference laws, which makes it a criminal offence to covertly act on behalf of a foreign power in a way that influences government policy or the exercise of democratic rights in Australia. The government last year announced that it was allocating an extra, I think, $90 million to law enforcement agencies, particularly AFP, to basically arrest people and prosecute them for engaging in foreign interference. I think that's a very, very powerful weapon. We haven't seen any prosecutions yet, but I think it's definitely had a chilling effect on some of the activities of the CCP in Australia, but by no means enough. And I think when we see the first prosecutions, that will be a very important milestone in Australia's path to resisting these kinds of coercive and subversive foreign interference.
Well, Clive, finally, I know that there was a bit of a journey that you took to trying to get the book published even, and I think 3 publishers decided not to dance with you.
It was extraordinary, Martin, because my publisher, Allen and Unwin, that had published some 8 of my previous books, very close, good friends with people there who loved the idea of this book about CCP influence in Australia. Very, very supportive. Instantly said, yeah, we'll publish, of course. And then very supportive all through the process of researching, writing, editing, getting it legaled, copy editing, and so on. And then just as the manuscript was about to be sent to be typeset, I got an email saying we're not going to publish this because we're afraid of retaliation from Beijing. And I was deeply shocked because I immediately saw that this was a most unwelcome but decisive vindication of the entire argument of the book, but it also meant I didn't have a publisher. And so I had to go hunting for one. It was really quite difficult. I expected, naively, I have to say, that other major publishers would come knocking on my door thinking, because when it became public that Alan and Unwin had dropped my book, it was a big international news story. I mean, everywhere, BBC, New York Times, you name it, Deutsche Welle, Japan Times, they could see the significance of it instantly. It was the first time anything like that had happened. And so I thought, well, publishers will come knocking on my door and saying, this is obviously going to be a bestseller. We'd love to publish it. No. They thought, ooh, well, if they're afraid of Beijing's retaliation, we are too. And so a couple of other publishers said, no, we're brave. We're going to do it, including Melbourne University Press, which was super keen until someone there in the university said, we have a lot of money coming in from Chinese students. Do we really want to publish this book? And so it was only, they pulled out, they got cold feet. And it was only when Sandy Grant at Hardy Grant Books said, no, we believe in free speech. And so at last I found a saviour, and they were absolutely fantastic, and they published it, and the rest of it is history.
Well, it's in its own right, the book is an illustration of the problem, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, indeed. And but it's had the book has done extremely well. It's been read by probably hundreds of thousands of Australians, and it's really played a role among a lot of other factors, and especially some fantastic journalism in Australia in helping educate the Australian public about the kind of threat, what to look for basically, and how to interpret certain events. And that's our best defensive weapon, to have an understanding of what's going on and be able then to resist, to be able to say no and say, no, we value our democratic institutions. We value our rights to free speech and free assembly and so on. And we're not going to have them eroded and undermined by an authoritarian foreign power.
Well, Clive, I thank you very much for your time today. That's been a very, very important conversation, I think, and we'll do our little bit to help spread the word so that people are more aware of the silent invasion.
Thanks, Martin.
Thank
Great
you very
to
much.
talk to you.
Take care.